Hello everybody and welcome back to Project O. Marissa and Kyle here again today, and we're going to talk to you about some animals that we find a lot here in Long Island Sound. We actually have already talked about them in both of our other Facebook Lives as well. So try to think back to what we talked about last Thursday and what we talked about with Callie and Debbie on Tuesday. So take some time to think about it. I'm going to start to draw one on the whiteboard so that you can actually start to get a hint of what we're looking at. So just a reminder, we are educators here in Groton at Project Oceanology, where we take all sorts of people out, a lot of school-age kids to learn about the ocean and some science in general. All right, I'm going to go.
All right, so while she's drawing some more hints, we are going to talk about a wide range of different kinds of this animal. Some are native and some are what we call invasive, meaning they didn't really start here, they came from somewhere else, but they've been successful enough to sort of continue their population in this area, and that can be a little troublesome for some native species because they may live in the same area, they may feed on some of the same things, and they can compete with each other. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail, but if you were wondering what we're talking about today, I'm actually just going to pan over because you can probably get a good guess now.
Take a look at my drawing. Can you figure it out by now? I'm not the best artist, but it's the thought that counts. So I drew the two biggest hints right away. So our animal has two really big claws, and then I need one more leg over here. And then they have 4 legs on each side. Their mouth is actually not on the top. I was just trying to be cute. So if you haven't figured it out by now, we're going to be talking about crabs today. So there are a lot of different species that we catch here in Long Island Sound. So I want to tell you a little bit about them first, and then we're actually going to meet some live crabs of 5 different species today. So, like I said, our crab has 2 claws and 4 legs, and they are a type of crustacean. So they actually will shed their exoskeleton or their outer layer, kind of like a snake sheds its skin. So another thing to know about a crab, since you've probably seen a lot of them when you're on the beach, is how to tell a male from a female crab. I explained how to do this with some of my family friends, and now every single time we go to the beach, they're constantly showing me this. So this is a cool trick to know. So if you flip a crab over and you look at the underside of its abdomen, there's usually a general shape. So if you are a male, it's usually a long, skinny shape. And then a female, let's draw that below. We'll do a quicker version. Usually has a more rounded abdomen. Like so. So we have the male here, and then the female is here. So my question for you is, why do you think males have a smaller abdomen than the female? Why do you think a female needs more space in her abdomen? We're going to come back to that. So like I said earlier, we talked about plankton the first time that we were together, and these animals actually start out the beginning of their life as plankton. So if you remember, zooplankton are these animal-type plankton. And if we kind of span over to here, you can actually see a picture of what these crabs look like when they're little. So these guys are very, very tiny. They're kind of swimming around at the surface. And they actually, at this point, they have a tail. So you can see it a little bit here. This is their main way that they can move while they're in this state. And eventually, that tail becomes this portion here that I drew. So, any guesses to what happened?
Yeah, so both Greta and Malcolm say And Graham here, they're all agreeing that it's because the female has to carry the eggs on the underside of that apron, that little flap, and that's exactly right.
Perfect. Yes. So the female is carrying these eggs, and once they're mature, they actually just get released into the water and start floating around. These crabs do not actually take care of their babies like humans or other mammals do. So really good. I'm really impressed that you guys already knew that. All right, so let's get started and look at one of the first crabs that we have here. So let's kind of span this way. So the first crab that we have is one of my favorites. So this is a lady crab, and you can see she's very active right now. Their back two sets of legs are really special. They are called swimmerettes. So there are only a few species of crabs around this area that have those swimmerettes. Another one that you might be familiar with is the blue crab. So these swimmerettes are very important for the way that they get their food. So these lady crabs will actually bury themselves in the sand or the mud, which is probably why she's moving around so much, because she doesn't have any mud in there right now. And they will bury their bodies almost completely, so only their eyes are coming out of the sand. And then, once a small fish or another crustacean comes along, they'll dart out of the sand and they will use their sharp, sharp claws to grab a hold of their prey and munch down. Woohoo! We got some cool action with that today. So you can see they can also use these swimmerettes to escape predators as well. So I want to try to pick her up, but these crabs are known for being pretty aggressive, so you might see her try to pinch me, but that is a chance I'm willing to take. Are you ready? All right. Woo! All right. So we got a nice up-close look at her. So you can see the sharp claws that we're talking about, her little eyes, and then I want to hold her claws real quick so that I can show you the shape of her abdomen. So with this lady crab, you can actually see that it's kind of more of a rounded shape. So we do have a lady crab. So even though they're called lady crabs, there are still males or boys of this species. The reason that they're called lady crabs is because of their intricate shell on top. So you can see all of those little purplish brown spots, and they're very ladylike, some people thought. So that is why they were named lady crabs. If you happen to see these guys while you're out, they're a really cool find, but be very careful because of those sharp claws. They also have some pretty cool iridescence, which is some shininess. I know it's probably hard to see on your camera.
Looks like it's coming up really nicely.
Okay, cool. Hopefully it translates. But you can see there's, especially if we're in a sunny environment, you'll be able to see that iridescence, which is another really cool feature that this species has. All right, she was very good for me, so I'm going to let her free. All right, and if you guys have any questions about any of these species as we go along, or just crabs in general, be sure to put them in the comments, and we will be checking them throughout the program. All right, on to our next species. This guy is almost the complete opposite as far as behaviors go. You can see he or she, we're going to check in a second, has not moved around very much at all. So this is an Atlantic mud crab. It's also known as a black-fingered crab too. They're very easy to spot because of the little black or brown claw tips, not fingertips, So you can see he's kind of in defense mode. He is doing the complete opposite. He's pretending instead of being aggressive, he's going to pretend like he's not even there and he's a rock. So you can tell if you look under the abdomen of the long, skinny abdomen, it is in fact a male. So he's opening his claws a little bit because he can tell that I know he's not dead. So these claws are pretty important to how this crab lives. So this crab lives in a muddy environment and uses these strong claws in order to kind of crush their prey. So some of the prey that they like the most are animals that have shells. So maybe other crabs, or their favorite are periwinkle snails. So you might have, I'm sure, if you've been to a beach that has rocks, seen a periwinkle snail. They're the most common ones that you see in this area. They will use these big claw to crush the shell, and then the smaller claw can get into the little spaces so they can get all of the meat out. All right. So these are the mud crabs. I'm going to put them right back down.
So Greta, age 6, wants to know if any of us have been pinched by these crabs.
Oh, very good question. Especially being a part of Project O, there's always a chance when you're not looking and they do pinch you. One time, I do remember getting pinched by a lobster, and that hurt. Also, we caught a lot of blue crabs on the boat this past fall, and one of them, I hate to admit it, one of them did get me a little bit. So that's a very, very good question. All right, so we're going to flip the script on Kyle.
All right.
He is going to teach us about a few of the other species.
So one of the we consider natives. This one is the last, and I'll just go ahead and take them out because they're not as feisty as the lady crab. You can see how slow moving they are. Slow moving enough that they can actually get this algae growing on their shell. You see how it's kind of waving off of their exoskeleton there. Now this will be removed once this crab grows and molts, but until then, this is actually a good feature for this animal because they can kind of blend into a muddy or dark bottom at the bottom of Long Island Sound. And that's where they like to live. You notice all the legs on this crab are pointed. They don't have those flattened swimmerettes. So they're not doing any swimming. They're just big and heavy, and they like to walk around the bottom. So I'll go ahead and take this big one out here, and the little one as well. All right, so you can see how slow moving they are. They're not ferocious predators like the lady crab. These animals actually prefer to eat something that moves much slower. We'll see if any of you have a guess of what these animals like to eat, and we'll talk about that at the end. But first I want to point out the differences between these two crabs. One is considerably larger than the other one, but these crabs are probably about the same age. So that's just one difference that we can tell between a male and a female. The males get considerably larger than the females. So if you look at the underside of the apron, it may be hard to tell because of all the mud and algae on their exoskeleton, but the females have that really, really round apron, it's called, on the underside of their abdomen, and that's where she carries the eggs. The male also shows a very skinny apron, almost looks like a lighthouse. So that's just that's a definite way to tell for pretty much all species of crabs, but the spider crabs, the males also get a lot bigger. That's not true for every crab that we have here. So these animals like to live down at the bottom. They move very slowly, and they have these really long claws. They're not as round and robust as the mud crab that we just saw, but they're kind of skinny, and they're good for reaching into tight spaces and pulling out little strips of food. So did anyone guess about what they eat?
Yes, both Iris and Greta thought they might eat snails, and their thought was because these snails are slow and the crabs are slow, maybe they could catch them.
So that's a really good guess, but actually this animal's favorite food moves even slower than snails. They like to eat something that doesn't move at all, dead stuff. All right, so these animals are scavengers. They like to crawl around the bottom. They can detect a decaying fish or some sort of animal that's down on the bottom from a long ways away, and then they slowly kind of wander over to it, and they use these long claws to kind of reach into the body of the animal and pull out little strips of meat. So they don't have to move very quickly at all for that. You can tell that these animals do not make very good predators because of how slow they are, and you couldn't really picture this chasing down a fish and catching it, right?
There was another guess, Kyle.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right. Chris, age 35, asked, do they eat detritus?
That's actually true too. So detritus is basically organic stuff that settles down to the bottom. It can be food from another animal. It could be their waste as well, or also dead stuff that sinks down to the bottom. So that is something that these animals are eating as well. They're going to be basically grazing on whatever they can get. So they're opportunistic. If they can grab a hold of something living and catch it, which is pretty hard for them to do, they will eat it. But mostly they're just walking around eating whatever they can catch. So dead stuff or stuff that's sinking down to the bottom. So good guess. All right, so now I want to move on to the last two species that we have. And these ones are pretty important for scientists to study. Because these are the non-native species. These are actually considered invasives. Now, starting out with the European green crab here, the European green crab was introduced in the late 1800s from, you may have guessed, Europe. All right. And this is a crab that likes to live in the rocky intertidal zone, where we were just broadcasting from earlier this week. So you may be able to find these under rocks and close to shore. Now you can see their claws are not long and spindly, they're more robust and rounded. So these animals are opportunistic feeders. They're going to basically be eating whatever they can catch in that rocky intertidal zone. They like to eat small mollusks and worms, smaller crustaceans as well. Now a good way to identify these species is based on their color. First of all, sometimes they are more brightly green, but as you can see, some of them are also really nice and orange on the underside. But the way I like to tell for sure is by looking at the spikes on the top side of their carapace, or their exoskeleton, and they'll actually have 5 of these spines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's easy for me to remember because green, the word green has 5 letters in it, G-R-E-E-N, and each one of these spikes can represent a letter of that word. So the green crab has 5 spines, and green has 5 letters in the word. So that's an easy way to remember how to identify them. All right. Excuse me. Now, these animals we do not find quite as often anymore since the last few decades, because there is actually another invasive species that's kind of competing with them. And we'll get a chance to look at that in a little bit. But we can still find these around a lot. They did kind of take the space of the native rock crab. They inhabit pretty much similar areas and they feed on similar things, so we're not finding as many of those native rock crabs anymore. And that's probably why we don't have one to show you today. But these are still pretty plentiful, but there is one that's even more plentiful, and I'll talk about how these animals were all introduced after we talk about that. All right, so moving on. Another rocky intertidal inhabitant, which we got to see on Tuesday, and these ones are really tiny and pretty sprightly. So this is the Asian shore crab, also called the Japanese shore crab or the purple shore crab. They can come in a bunch of different colors, but they're easy to tell apart from the green crab because they have these banded legs, and also you notice they don't have those 5 spines. They only have a few spines on the side of their eyes there. They also don't get quite as big as the green crab. You can see this one is pretty tiny, but we do also have a exoskeleton molt from a pretty large individual. So this is about as big as they can get. They don't get much bigger than this. They do have these robust claws as well for eating pretty much similar things as the green crab and the mud crab. They like to eat mollusks and worms and things like that. But there are a few differences between this and the green crab. You notice this has a very flat back, so it can kind of scoot under tight spaces, and they don't get quite as big as the green crab, so they can hide in smaller spaces as well. They also have a much faster reproductive cycle, which is part of why these animals are so successful. These shore crabs were introduced to the east coast of the United States in the late 80s and early 90s, and they've been able to kind of take off in population here because of how successfully they can outcompete the native species and the green crabs that have been here for about 100 years before them. And also, their life cycle is very fast. So in 1 year, a female crab can actually have a few clutches of eggs, and each female crab is going to be producing a few thousand, sometimes over 10,000 eggs in a single breeding. They don't take very long to reach adulthood because they don't have to grow quite as big until they can get to a reproductive size. And so they basically just produce a whole lot of these little crabs, and each one of them is really good at outcompeting native species. So when I talked about how many little babies they're having, does anyone have a guess about how these crabs got here? Or they came from different areas. So this one came from Asia. The green crab came from Europe. Does anyone know how they came to the east coast of the United States? It has to do with what we were talking about earlier in the video and what I just talked about during their reproduction. All right. So I'll give you a minute to take a guess on that. But first, I'm going to get this one back in the water. There we go. Oh, maybe it just wants to hang out on my finger now. Feels safe. All right, there we go. So it has to do with all those thousands of little babies that each one of these is going to be producing. So when they reproduce, they are going to shake their eggs kind of off into the water column, and each one of those eggs is going to hatch and become one of those little tiny swimming planktonic crabs.
We had Dan
Yeah.
actually say ballast water. So could you...
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So ballast water. So some of you might not know what that means exactly, but ballasts are a feature on ships that kind of help them float depending on how much cargo they're carrying or how heavy they are. So basically they take water into these ballast holds from wherever they are, and then they're going to be transporting goods across the ocean. So these crabs came in ballast water from ships from Asia. So a ship in Asia would draw water in from an Asian port to kind of help its buoyancy as it sailed across the ocean. And then it would come over here bringing goods usually, but when it came to America, it would release that ballast water into the ocean once it gets here. And guess what's floating in that ballast water from the Asian area? It's the baby crabs. So all those little tiny plankton floating around when the ballast water goes into those ballast holds, they're going to be sucked in with it. They can hang out there for the duration of the transit from Asia or from Europe to America. And then when that ship releases the eggs, it releases that water, all those eggs are going to pour out as well, or the planktonic crabs. And they're pretty hardy, so they can survive the journey. And then when they come here, it's not too different from where they came from. It's relatively the same temperature, and there's plenty of food on the East Coast as well, so they were able to succeed here. So they came as little babies, and then they grew up here, and then once they grow up, they can start producing a bunch of more eggs.
So they do not come over in those ships as adults, like the big crabs that we just saw.
Right. Yeah, they come in as those little swimming larvae, we call them, or plankton.
Okay. Molly said, what about in seaweed?
So that would be another guess too. Sometimes there are invasive species that will cling on to seaweed or floating algae that also gets drawn in there. Floating algae can also be kind of kicked around different bodies of water by currents if it's floating. Storms can move them around, and sometimes there will be eggs or other animals kind of attached to it, and they can settle down wherever that seaweed ends up. So that could be another option for other invasive species as well.
All right. So I hope you guys were able to learn a little something about crabs today. And if you have any other questions, please put them in the comments. We will be looking at those comments even after this video is over. So we'll be able to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for listening to our Facebook Live today. Our next Facebook Live is actually going to be at a different time. So it's going to be at 1:30 in the afternoon. So be on the lookout for the event that we're going to be posting on Facebook, and make sure that you are looking especially at the time and the date, because it's going to be a little special. We are going to be visiting a fish ladder that is local, and they're going to be telling us all about how that goes on. So I'm excited to learn some as well. So thank you guys so much for joining, and we will definitely see you around.
All right,
have a good
see you
one.
next time.
Bye.